You're muted, Fred.
That explains why nobody said hello back. I was checking my speakers. It was me the whole time. Welcome, everybody. We're closing in on it here in week 12. Good to see you all. And got a few things to cover here in the beginning before we go. So I've received the pitch decks. I've looked at them briefly, but I haven't graded them yet, which I'd hoped to do for today. But it presents an interesting opportunity. So what I want to do is I thought, since originally I'd thought we'd present those in class and we didn't really get to, we were covering so much material. And this week is a little bit lighter. So I thought I'd offer 5 points extra credit if you want to practice presenting and present your pitch deck in the second half of class today. It's not necessary. You're going to be presenting your business plans, which will have an element of that. But if you feel like jumping in and taking a practice swing and giving context to your pitch deck today, then that would be 5 points ahead out of the gates. And then I'll get those graded in the next, hopefully, day or two. So you'll be able to get some feedback prior to making final approach on business plans. So at some point here in the first 15 minutes, let me know either verbally or in chat so that I can allow enough time for whoever wants to do that. But that I saw as an opportunity opening up since we have some time in today's class and those haven't been graded yet. Make sense? Anybody want to volunteer out of the gates? Okay. Take your time. No pressure. So we're missing somebody here. Richard. Okay. What else? I think that's it. I mean, we can get into it here. This is the last of the material. So next week, we're going to be reviewing business plan. We're going to be starting to review final. So if you, and I'll look at the last couple quizzes, look for some common answers that had more misses than most and make sure we cover that. But also, the next week is really an opportunity for you to think about anything you want to get some clarity on, bring in as a question, either on your group project that'll be submitted or on what anything for your own benefit or for the final exam, if that makes sense. So next week we'll have some time for that. Any other questions pending before we kind of jump into material? All right. Give me 1 second. Let me get this ready. All right. All right, so we're covering, oops. All right, so that title is wrong, but the rest of this is right. So hospitality wasn't really covered separately in the syllabus. And as I'm working on what this class will look like in the 4-credit format, and just thinking that this is an important part of operating and marketing a brewery, I wanted to include it. So it sort of comes under this competency as best fit. But what we're going to do is review the impact of including a tasting room, the differences that creates in approach and business structure. We've mostly covered the difference between production and distribution. Some of it will come up today, but also the relational differences. So how a tasting room is different for you in terms of your connection to customers and your brand identity. So that kind of summarizes what we're going over. So I thought about it in kind of 2 lanes. And first of all, there's this summary that I found this interesting from my vantage point in terms of what it looked like when I came into the business is entirely different than what it looks like now. As I said, any example of a consumer getting a glass of alcohol from directly from the producer is an exception to the original framework way back when. And when I came into the business, it was still minimal. It was still in the beginning stage of those exceptions being made. And I thought this was an interesting point that I then looked up to just to make sure I was right. And like, all manufacturing licenses in Michigan provide the opportunity to include a tasting room. They don't require it, and they may require an additional step like a tasting room permit for distilleries, etc. But beer, wine, spirits all have the opportunity to create a space where they can sell direct to the consumer. And that doesn't mean it's required, meaning you can also operate a manufacturing business and sell through distribution without having that tasting room, without having direct sale to consumer. So it remains a choice, but it's a choice in all business licenses. So that's interesting, and it just points to the fact that it's a strategic decision on your part on whether you want to include it or not, and whether it's a main focus, whether it's the main driver, or whether it's a secondary driver or resource. So how much you focus on it, how much of it's part of your growth, meaning if you're sold nationwide or internationally and have hundreds of thousands of barrels, then your tasting room is going to be a smaller percentage of your business than if you don't. And that's all strategy at this point and framework. So what I thought was important was to kind of look at these two categories in terms of how does this influence your consumer connection, and how does this influence operations and infrastructure, which is interesting thinking about the title of this class, which is basically operations and marketing. And that's, I didn't realize it till just now, but that's kind of how this really shows up.
Fred, I just wanted to ask a question, because I guess that the name of it, tasting room, is somewhat confusing to me. I don't know what the consumer would feel, but I think that a tasting room is like when you go to one of these wineries and they give you, different, wines or beers or whatever, and you take a sip and then you buy a bottle and leave. And I just think that for some reason that name tasting room is confusing. And I would say, because, if you're selling beer by the pint or by the flight or, whatever, I mean, it's, you might offer like, yeah, you can taste it, but you're going to buy something. I would think it would be better to call it a bar, or, something where people would expect to go in there and buy a beer and sit down and drink it.
I think that is fair point. And tasting room is sometimes a legal term. So I think the distillery exceptions actually call them tasting room permits. Others may not. I use it. I would say that without looking it all up, I would say that it's a term that I use a lot. And the reason I use it here is that I want to clarify the difference between a bar that's a retailer with a Class C license, a brew pub that has a specific brew pub license of the state of Michigan, and the place where you go into a bar that's owned by a brewery and you only buy their beer. So I'm using it as a way to talk about, if you have a customer coming in who has the ability to buy by the glass, sit down and have it on your premise, I'm considering that a tasting room, not meaning sampling, not meaning for free. I can understand that correlation, but for me, it's a term that's universal, that connects across licenses and doesn't confuse terms by borrowing the name of another license. So I mean, I know from a business point of view, we would always call it the pub, but we were technically a microbrewer. So in the class setting, that could confuse things about, hey, in your brew pub, but then there's a brew pub, there's a microbrewer, there's a small distiller, there's a distiller. They can all have tasting rooms in my universal terminology. And their license may change. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it does. And I guess that's where I was, had my, question was, in which aspect are we talking? So that does clarify it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, and for the purposes of this class, when it comes to I refer to it on the quiz, I refer to it in these upcoming slides. I'm really glad you asked it, because for the purpose of this class, just recognize that I'm talking about that space where a producer can sell by the glass, regardless of license. Well, regardless of the difference between licenses. And then when it comes to your own business, the beauty is you can call it kind of whatever you want, and you need to get the applicable license, but that's where the opportunities change. So that's a great clarification, and now we'll jump in. So from a consumer connection, these are a lot of bullet points to go through. But that's kind of what it is just looking at these different points. And I'll kind of go through them each, I think. So one, I think that's really important is that your tasting room, is an opportunity for you to create the standard for your brand experience. I mean, one of the things that I have preached about over the years is that, when you're out in the trade, when you're in distribution, you don't have a whole lot of control about your environment, about what sign they put over the door, what the back bar looks like, whose branding is up, whose coasters they're using, what it looks like, what kind of glassware they use. All that stuff that is around your product is out of your control. You may be able to influence it, but when it's your building and your space, you can really create the standard that, and we'll get through it later, what that can, that influences several of these other points, but others can learn from that brand experience. But at this point, if somebody's in your space, you can really manage that space to be exactly how you want your brand surrounded. So whether that's ambiance, whether it's branding, whether it's something technical like glassware or temperature, you have opportunities there that you don't elsewhere. And that goes into the next point, which is you can influence all aspects of serving your product. So if you want it just so, if you want a lemon wedge on the glass, you can make it so. If you don't want a lemon wedge on the glass, you can make it so. If you want it served a certain way, you have an opportunity to train the staff and kind of set that benchmark. And that certainly feeds in, a lot of these feed into that brand experience that I'm talking about. But again, you have much more influence and control. You want your lines cleaned every week, clean them every week. You can't dictate that at retail once your beer is out in the public space. You can recommend it, you can help advise, you can make suggestions, but you have a lot less control. Same thing with spirits. You think about if your spirit really is really showcased with a certain cocktail or in a certain format or with a certain method of serving, then you can create those recipes, those elements, those ways of serving it, and shine it in its very best light. So you're going to get more direct consumer contact, which is just saying there'll be more people meeting you, your brand ambassadors, your people in person. Now that could be challenged if you looked at, some of these 50 state breweries that have 20 salespeople out there. They're meeting a lot of people and they're going to a lot of festivals and events and they're meeting a ton of people. But I still say that the collective you meeting you in your space where you're creating a standard for the brand experience is still, by having a pub, there's people that are coming to that location and saying, I've been at the brewery, I've been at the distillery. And that's different than meeting somebody out at an event in a restaurant somewhere else, many states away. Both are important and both are valuable, but I just think having a tasting room means more people can say they've been there. And the next point is just another way of looking at that and saying that they can also come there more often. So somebody can say, this is my local, I'm there every week, versus somewhat more of a random or once in a while. I met somebody from the brewery at a beer dinner once 3 years ago is different than they're my people. I go there, I know them, they know me. I have a personal relationship with this place and these people. That's a powerful thing for a brand. You think about some brands that we give a lot of money to on the regular and we don't have that. And then there are brands where we have that and it makes it a different type of purchase. There's a different type of loyalty, right? So we have big brands and things that we give money to, like, you know, I don't know, Apple or whatever. But I'm not visiting them at Mecca and I don't know anybody there to say, if I have a question, if I have a comment, or if I'm not spreading word of mouth in the same way that I would for a friend's business, or somebody that I know who I visit frequently, like a regular restaurant. You know, this puts us in the realm of being a regular at a restaurant. And even though that seems so normal right now, it seems like a silly point to make, but it wasn't that long ago where we were distribution only business. We were manufacturers that would make products and put them into distribution. So we didn't have this contact prior to 1993. I think that's pretty fascinating and just a reminder about one of the advantages, one of the things that changes when you have this tasting room, whatever it's called, is frequency and number of direct consumer relationships. So you also have a broadened customer range, which is sort of a for better or worse comment. Is that you're going to get families, you're going to get kids that aren't your customers, but are coming along with your customers. They would not necessarily be engaged with your brand if you were distribution only. They may be in the store, they may not, but now you're having, you know, people, their family, and if you're allowing it, their kids at the table, that are all part of that. Their relationship with your brand is now changed, and how you accommodate their family and their kids that aren't buying alcohol is also part of that brand relationship. Whether or not you want to do that is a strategic decision, but if they're coming in, how you do it is going to be part of their impression and their brand relationship. Then also, this is an important one, is guests of destination customers. So I kind of made that term up, but I'm just thinking the destination customer is the person who decided to go to your place. And if they're bringing a group of 5, some of them might be there for the first time. They might be there because they wanted to join their friends, not because they like craft beer, not because they like craft spirits, but because their friends went there. So what that experience is like for the guest is going to be their brand relationship with you, maybe with the whole segment, whether they like craft beer or don't like craft beer. And it may, depending on the experience, influence that destination customer's brand relationship. So I brought my friends here, but nobody else liked it but me. They felt, you know, they felt like it was an elitist place that didn't treat them well, so I can't bring them here anymore. So now I can only go here when I'm solo. That's a dramatic example, but it's an example where the experience of the guests who weren't planning on going there anywhere, might not be in your target consumer demographic, influenced the frequency or the opinion of the guest who was in your demographic. And that doesn't happen as much on the shelves in distribution or in a restaurant, where I can order, you know, crazy double imperial stout from the bar, and my friend could order a Bud Light, and there's no issue. We go to a brew pub, and that world shrinks a little bit. Their choices aren't as available if they're in that, you know, regular light domestic lager audience. So broaden customer range is the point here, is that once you open a tasting room, people beyond your target audience that are most likely to love you are also coming through the door. and at the first point is an acknowledgement of that, and then the strategy is sort of next. So it's an opportunity to educate the industry and the community. So this really ties back up into that opportunity to create the standard for the brand experience and influence the aspects of serving your product that if you want other retailers and industry professionals to understand how your brand should be served, well, coming into your place and seeing it at its best is one way that happens. Setting that bar is the first part of spreading it. And that can be either formally, like, hey, we're going to bring distributor people here, we're going to bring our top retailers here, and they're going to have an experience and really see us in all our glory. And it can also just happen organically. I mean, as a way, as sort of a sidebar, it's surprising me to think of this import experience in the world of all these other great examples in our state. But I think about, people having a pint of Guinness at Guinness Brewery is different and could influence how they look at Guinness for the rest of their lives. Something that Guinness did really well, and being the lead nitrogen poured stout in the world for so long. One, it was mistreated a lot in the marketplace, so it created a dramatic difference. But then two, they really came back around and said, the best pour, that there is this concept of a best pour. And I think that was a branding and marketing effort that connected to brand identity and this standard of brand experience, that a number of people started to understand the difference of how that beer could be poured better. And if you went to the brewery, you would have that. The more people that they got to either go to the brewery or go to these prime accounts that did that well, the more the treatment of that brand improved. So that was an opportunity to educate the industry and the community and have people raise their bar of expectation of what a pint of Guinness looked like. So even though that's sort of far and wide, I did sell Guinness for a while on the distributor side in a major market. So, and it was right when they were changing that image. So that remains a pretty, that had an impact on me on watching how they kind of pivoted and raised their profile through improving their draft service. And that's something that you can be doing. It's an opportunity, and it's also sort of an obligation that, I think breweries ought to have the absolute best draft system and best bartenders in terms of bar service in the industry. If they don't, I don't know how they're expecting it to improve outside of their four walls magically. So we really need to lead the service of our products. Same with distilleries. If you have a bar, I would expect really knowledgeable bar service and really excellent sort of, it doesn't, and by excellent, I don't mean fancy, but the methods of making cocktails ought to be above average. They ought to be industry leading in terms of how that product is treated behind the bar, because that can help encourage other people to take a look at their bar standards and say, oh, wow, I thought I knew how to make cocktails, but we were just mixing shot and pops. I went here. This was really beautiful. That was a work of art. I think I'd like to go back to the bar that I own and figure out how to up our game in terms of treating local craft spirits and making better cocktails. Does that make sense? We trip over that sometimes because we're manufacturers trying to operate bars, tasting rooms. And so sometimes it's outside of our skill set to then operate and serve at a bar because we're really manufacturers. And so I'm just bringing light to that to say, once you open a tasting room, you're no longer only a manufacturer. So offer heightened value to the community. This is just, thinking about other industries is a great example. Many of you are in the sphere of auto industry one way or another, or manufacturing, and there could be a pretty highfalutin manufacturer in a community and not everybody knows it unless they're related to an employee or unless they are engaged in some way, because the public isn't going in and out of those doors. So sometimes those manufacturer industries have a low community profile, except for the ones who are intentionally stepping out and supporting events and community action and sponsorship and really raising their profile. But people don't always have a understanding of what it's like in the four walls, or what their company culture looks like, or feels like, or what their brand is about. So when we move from being just a producer, I shouldn't say just a producer, when we move from being a manufacturer slash producer that's industry, and not having consumer connection, when we open our doors to consumers, we become a different community member. We become a retailer that they frequent. We become a place that they gather, a place that they know people at. And they don't have to do that just through employees. So we have a different, and typically viewed as a more valuable connection to the community in both directions, us to them and them to us, when we're opening our doors and we're seeing customers there. And then I don't know that it's always fair either, because manufacturing can contribute a lot to a community, but having a tap room on Main Street, or revitalizing a less not currently Main Street area by opening a tasting room and creating that positive retail on-premise traffic is often what ends up being something that the communities will tout as one of the reasons to come to their town. And that seems to happen a little more frequently with an on-premise brand than just a manufacturing brand. And I think it takes less volume to have an impact, because of that increase in consumer in-person contact and frequency. You can be a smaller revenue, smaller barrel brewery and become a darling of your community a lot quicker than a large volume producer who does not have consumer contact. They would need to be a bigger business force before the community really put them on their brochures. That's a little bit of a subjective interpretation there, but I think it holds water, and hopefully that'll make sense to you. It's just one of the assets of opening your doors to the public. You become a public part of the community. So we talked about PR last week, and I put that in parentheses here because as I was writing it, I was realizing that it's really PR in action, which is that you get to in this space, you can really demonstrate your values, your mission, your messaging, and people can see it in action. This is where, instead of slogans and phrases and trying to tell people who you are and what you do and what it looks like, and what it looks like for your values to be in action, you get to show them. So they get to come in and see the culmination of your values, your vision, your training, your teamwork, all of that in motion. And so people can really walk away with a personal assessment of why they like you, instead of hearing why they should like you and then determining whether that's true. They can just say, I love that place. It's got a feel that is just right for me. I love how they treat people, whatever it is. I love that they're into the things that I'm into. That place is my place. Those people are my people. That can happen organically anywhere, but especially in your space, because your values can be front and center. And that's a great example of show me, don't tell me. And that to me is an example of public relations. You are relating to the public here. Now, there also is branding and marketing taking place in your four walls, but their experience being personal and organic, if it's done well. Well, it's personal and organic whether it's done well or not. It just has a different effect. That if people go in there and say, I like their brand until I visited them, and then it really seemed like it wasn't aligned with my values. Once I saw them in person, I'm out of here. That is values, mission, and messaging in action and relating to the public. It's just not the way they wanted it to go. So I think recognizing this as something that's going to happen once you open your doors to the public should help you shape it in the way that you want to have the desired effect. So in the show me, don't tell me, on the education side, I'm kind of illustrating that these things are there. On the advice side, I'm saying that's also something you can't really fake. And the show me, don't tell me is going to mean that it's going to be honest, and it's going to be whether you like it or not. So it creates an obligation to really work on those things, in my opinion. So another thing is that it's instant feedback. It's an opportunity for instant feedback if it's heard, and it's a great opportunity for market research. And there's plenty of jokes about that, and they're funny. They're also true in that, the R&D, or we're sitting at the bar, we're doing R&D. The bar is an opportunity to get feedback from customers about what they like, how they like it, whether you're looking at numbers and seeing what sold most in your pub versus what sold most in the market. Those are different environments. And so both are sets of data that's interesting. But feedback from the customers, what they say, especially if they're saying in a relaxed format instead of a market research focus room, or getting a poll, what they say to the bartender, what they say to the drinker next to them, that's really valuable. And finding ways to hear it and not stop it or discount it will make it even more valuable. And I say that because there's some instincts when you make something, you've worked really hard, and you're at the table or the bar, you want to sort of sell it, and that's natural and important and valuable, and I don't want to discount that. But if somebody's saying, I'm not sure about this, there's also a time to say, why? Tell me more. What do you like? What do you don't like about it? Instead of going into that, let me get you something that you like, I'm so sorry, and whisking away and treating it as a mistake. When they're in your space, in your pub, you have an opportunity for information. So again, sort of in the advice column, it's like pause and listen and let people tell you what their response is to your efforts, and you'll be able to shape them with that response in mind. That doesn't mean you have to do everything they like. It doesn't mean you have to make everything that like, but it's still market research to understand what else is that customer saying. What are the things they like? It could mean maybe that's why are we drawing these? This isn't the customer I intended to draw. So what do I got to change my customer makeup? Meaning somebody could say, I need cheaper beer, and stronger shots. And you could realize, oh, well, that's really interesting. Where do you normally go, or something like that, or something that draws the communication that could help you just decide maybe we're drawing the wrong people. Doesn't mean they're wrong for liking those things, but they may not be aligned. And if you realize that you needed to sort of shift who was hearing about your place, that would come from some of those conversations versus saying, you're wrong, or too bad, or maybe we need to get, lighter beer and stronger shots. It doesn't always have a direct correlation to what you need to do. Sometimes it's just filling your landscape of information so that you can make, you can take it in. Like we were saying about market survey, there's a gear where you just need to collect. And then there's another gear where you start to form strategies based on what you collected. The pub, the tasting room is an amazing place to get that information if you can hold that space. All right, so that is sort of the collection of how it changes your consumer connections. The next slide then is talking about its influence on operations and infrastructure. So for one, you got the environment to consider. That if you're, we were primarily a production industry up until not so long ago. And the space that you needed to create to make beer and spirits is considerably different than the space you need to create to sell it by the glass. In that you need retail building type, you need retail building space, you need bathrooms, you need more bathrooms, prettier space, ADA rated space, all that sort of stuff comes into mind. So there's a physicality that changes immediately when you say we're going to have customers in here drinking by the glass. Staff, you're going to need more employees right away. They're going to need to be trained not only on your brand but on serving and on product. And so the difference is there's brand is really how they're talking about you and your products. Serving is, do they know how to serve that product at its very best with the very best methods? And do they know about the products? Can they talk about beer, spirits, food? That is sort of maybe redundant at times with brand, but I think it's different. Understanding, Cicerone level beer awareness is different than understanding your brewery brands, because now you're putting your employees out in the position of being experts to the industry at home base, at at the showcase. So they're going to be held to a higher standard. If you're at a brewery and you ask somebody about a beer style that happens to be outside of their portfolio but is standard beer style and they don't know what you're talking about, you start to question the entire brewery's beer IQ because a server didn't know what a Hefeweizen was. All right, so those servers are going to reflect on your brewery's status when the consumer asks them a question inside your four walls. If a server fails a question like that in a restaurant, I don't hold the brewery accountable. In a brewery, I do. That makes sense? So you not only have the training to do, but you have higher stakes.
Would you, Fred,
Yep.
Can you repeat that again? My headphones went in and out.
Yeah, I'm not sure which part you missed, but I was saying you not only have more training to do than you would if you were traditional production, but you also have higher stakes, because if you have your employees are representing your overall brand. So if they don't appear to be beer or spirit experts or knowledgeable, not just about your brand, but about beer and spirits in general, then that customer could say, man, I went to the brewery and the server didn't know what they were talking about. That could really diminish their opinion of the whole brand.
Right.
And that
so you're saying you hold them accountable for that, but if like in a brew pub for the help and stuff, is that what you're?
Yeah, I'm saying a server in a brew pub has a higher standard of excellence, should have a higher standard of excellence to be a beer expert than a traditional restaurant serving beer. I want the restaurant to also have this standard. But if I'm the consumer and I go into a bar and grill that's serving craft beer and I order Paul's and I want to talk to him about what is Paul's Hefeweizen, what does that taste like? And they don't know what a Hefeweizen is or what it tastes like. My disappointment, my brand relationship at that point is with the restaurant not having trained personnel. But if I go to Paul's Brewery and the server at Paul's Brewery doesn't know what a Hefeweizen is, especially if you serve a Hefeweizen, but even if you don't, I start thinking, man, the servers at that brewery don't even know about beer. So I could start to relate that to my opinion of the brewery itself. And like, I don't know that they know what they're doing, because I would think at least at a brewery, the server should know about beer. So what I'm saying is that there's a heightened expectation of industry knowledge when you're at an industry producer even though it's still a server who's bringing glasses of beer to the table, we expect more out of them when you're at a brewery. Or I do. I think your ideal target audience does. So anyways, that was just inside of saying, not only, so if you were just a manufacturer, if you were just a brewer without a tasting room, you don't even have to have servers. You're training brewers and packagers and cellar people and you know, warehouse staff. You don't even have this employee to train. Open a tavern, open a tasting room. You have the employees, and now you have whole new categories of training that you didn't have before. And you have a heightened market expectation that they're not going to give you free passes for misses, or not many. And then we mentioned this to, I kind of put this on both slides because I thought it had impact. We talked about the expanded customer accommodations. So we talked about how the kids and how they're treated and guests of destination customers and their impression is going to affect your brand. This is here to say, all right, so if you're allowing families, we haven't even talked about food yet, which is on the next column. But if you're having food, or if you're not having food, you know, if you're all about beer, but you're going to allow families and kids to come in, now you need beverages for them, or food for them, or snacks for them, or high chairs, or, you know, like this is just talking about operations infrastructure. Is that, why do I need high chairs on my purchasing list if I'm opening a distillery? Well, if you're opening a tasting room and you're allowing families, I'm not even saying that they have to be on the list, but they now have to be considered, whereas a straight manufacturer, that would never even come into the picture. So if nothing else, I'm pointing at the fact that you open that door, which we all are, it's the trend, and I'm not recommending against it, but I'm saying it opens many doors. And so guests as well, like, I think there's a lot of breweries, microbrewers, and brew pubs that have expanded their offerings based on trying to appeal to the table. I know, you know, in my history, that was part of the decision to add a winemaker's license and work bond to bond with a local winery. It wasn't so much that wine was the passion of the organization, but we didn't want to lose, once we had a larger tasting room, we didn't want to lose a whole table because one person didn't drink beer and only drank wine. So we felt it was strategic to have wine for the guests of the beer customers, to be able to bring their table of six in and have dinner, and not have somebody uncomfortable because they didn't drink beer. That certainly shows up, you know, I think I think 20 years ago that was showing up because craft beer was a stretch for a large part of the market. Now it's showing up because gluten and carbs can be a stretch for people. And so if they come in and say, I can't drink beer anymore, that whole group might go somewhere else if you don't accommodate them, which means, what do my other alcohols look like? What do my gluten-free options look like? What do my non-alcoholic options look like? And I'd go so far, if we go back to branding and marketing, I'd go so far as, do my non-alcoholic options look like us? I, still find that a lot of breweries miss on this, and there's a giant Coca-Cola dispenser or Pepsi dispenser. There's no thought towards non-alcoholic beverages. They're going with the Bud Light of soft drinks, and it's printed on their glasses and sat on their tables, and the only lit sign in the room is something that's antithetical to their mission if it were beer. So again, the structural part is, think about it. The advice part is, can you express your brand values and identity in your non-alcoholic offerings, in your food offerings, in your offerings that are still to these people who might not have adopted the craft ethos yet? I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. But you also don't want to draw such a hard line that they don't feel accommodated and they feel like that place is weird. I didn't recognize anything. I didn't want to drink kombucha, so I'm out of here. That line of where you are in that is all your personal and brand preference. But I'm pointing out to some potential results and strategies. So additional responsibilities for non-employees, and by that I mean consumers, is you have a different insurance obligation and a different infrastructure to accommodate for non-employees being on the property. So we kind of talked about that in the building and space. And I just wanted a broad stroke here versus teaching that, but you know, having liability insurance for alcohol consumed on the premise is just different than if it wasn't there. The standard is not, there are standards for it. So it's not like you're dealing in unicorns, but there's a significant shift once you start having non-employees come through your door. You're going to need to do the things the insurance company asks you to do, and create the infrastructure that supports that approach, for lack of a better word. Hours of service is pretty straightforward. If you were, 8 to 5 or something as a manufacturer, if you can imagine what would we be without the tasting room, it'd probably be a traditional Monday through Friday production schedule. Fermentation doesn't rest, so there could still be some staggered scheduling where maybe there's 7 days a week that people are in the building, but 5 days that are heavy. But you add a tasting room and that changes. Now there's an emphasis on weekends and on nights. And so figuring out how are we going to do this? I think this is one of the things I just point out, especially for a small operation who's thinking about a partner team that may be a couple of people and opening with maybe 2 to 4 employees. This is a big deal, is that now you're stretching your schedule to, as consumers, what do we want from an establishment? Are we expecting them to be, it depends on the area, right? So there's places that I don't expect to be open for lunch because of where they are and who they are. And there's places that I do expect to be open for lunch. And there's, if you look at restaurants, there's restaurants that are open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner 7 days a week. So we are now starting to blend that line. If we're opening a tasting room, especially if we are adding food, where, what are the expectations that we create for our consumers are important. And just the reality of tasting room is going to stretch the number of hours this building needs to operate, and the number of people that I think translates to the one on the left column, which is translates to the number of people we're going to need to satisfy those demands. So some of these, they seem so basic, but I think it's easy to forget about when you're in planning stages and you assume some trends, like, of course we're going to have a tasting room. And sometimes they'll hide for an amazingly long period of time before you realize who's working till midnight on Friday and Saturday every week for the rest of our lives. Having a plan for that is, the sooner you sort of recognize that, oh, I'm also planning on being there Monday at 9 a.m. Oh, what have I done? I've scheduled myself Monday to Sunday for 12 hours a day. That's not sustainable for an individual or 2 people. So figuring out a strategy to deal with that and is important. And that's an infrastructure operations impact from adding a tasting room to the business model. And these days, it's hard to find somebody who hasn't added a tasting room. So it is the reality, but it is in addition to what our model used to be. So additional competencies, fancy way of saying skills you're going to need and areas of focus that you're going to need that aren't your original, that may not have been your original goal. If I just want to make and sell beer, I want to make whiskey. Well, opening a tasting room, if you're adding food, now you need to be skilled or find somebody to join the team who's skilled at food production. You know, it would be great if they could hold the same level of passion, mission, and value and craft perspective and ethos towards food that they do your beverage, because that's a common disconnect. I think you've probably already heard me, go on about that, but it's very common for, especially if you go back when this stuff was first opening up, the opportunities where that food was an afterthought, and we're just trying to feed our customers for our beer. So the sort of assembly kitchens that comparatively would be like making, malt extract homebrew, or worse yet, add water beer kits. Um, Whereas sort of the equivalent of the kitchens in these breweries, and I think there's an opportunity there to express your craft identity through your kitchen as well. So that's a whole nother skill set. Pardon me, that needs to be considered. Same with service. We mentioned these as their influence on brand, and this is meaning, yeah. So in order to have a positive brand experience with service, we're going to need somebody who knows what they're doing with service. We're going to need the skill behind that training that will change the brand impact and save money and logistics as well. That, I think everybody here has probably experienced a restaurant in the weeds failing, at least as a consumer, if not as an employee at some point. And that is not just an unfavorable brand experience. It can cost a lot of money, either in sales or in waste. So coming out and being underskilled at serving a busy restaurant and then getting really busy is costly, on both sides of this, on the literal logistic costs and on the brand identity costs. So finding a way to develop your skill sets there is important. Same with community engagement. Once you're a restaurant, how are you going to get people in who's, shaking hands and saying hello to the community members, making nice with the other restaurants on the street, making nice with whatever organizations are around or coming in and asking for sponsorships for bowling teams and what have you. That is not as important with a non-public space. It's essential once you have that space. Pardon me for a second. Additional marketing segments just kind of means, what we've been talking about is that there's whole other areas to reach here, and different ways to brand. So now you're not just branding a beverage, you're branding a restaurant or something like it, or tours. It's different people, you just think about, I think about it, New Holland and Holland, I would have never equated our brand. I came in there after the brewery was already rolling. I would have never equated our brand with hockey parents. It wasn't part of our origin story. We had to know how to market to hockey parents because there was an annual hockey tournament in town that, was a significant event for the tasting room every year. So, like it or not, they were coming. So we had to figure out how to talk with them ahead of time, how to manage our group space, how to engage with them, create positive experiences, how to proactively dissuade certain activities, because, there were certain things we didn't want to happen that would happen if it wasn't managed. Like in that case, they would kind of come in and the parents would all have dinner and let their kids run wild over in the room that had some games. And so it was like there were things we had to discourage, things we had to encourage, and we had to know when those tournaments were happening and kind of manage our marketing effort of how we invited them into our space, because the more proactive we were with some of that messaging, the more the right part of that audience we got. But the point is, that audience wasn't part of our marketing segments until they became restaurant related. So now we were one of the restaurants in town that could handle group set size. So now we need another skill there. We need to be able to talk restaurant speak. And just an interesting note. Adjacent beverage segments. I really talked about this already. I kind of covered it when we went into expanded customer accommodations, and it's it's an element of that. But I think in this bullet point, we're talking about the skill set now of not only do we need to recognize that our choices there are different for the brand relation, our choices there are going to include different ingredient, different sources of supply, different ingredients on board, different menus, but also, do we have people knowledgeable in these things? And if not, what are we doing to build it? So I mentioned that, if you go to a distillery, you are not expecting somebody in their tasting room to say, I don't know anything about cocktails, I'm just here to pour you samples. I mean, actually, the reality is I may expect that in some settings, but I think it's lost opportunity when that happens. And it does usually inform my opinion of that distillery. Being a behind the scenes person, it may inform my opinion of their training of retail staff versus whether they know anything or not. But a less informed customer may just chalk it up to the whole shooting match. So the point here is that these are listed again under additional competencies, because these are skills you'll need as an organization if you're going to include these aspects. And it's all related to that initial single door of saying, yes, we're going to have a tasting room. So the next thing we're going to talk about gets a little dicier, and I wasn't even sure whether I wanted to include it, but we're going to go into kind of the difference of pricing and margin between production and hospitality. I'm not going back into a deep dive of Excel or anything, but I think I'll pause for a minute before we go to that slide and just talk about these elements of, is there anything you think we're missing here in terms of things that could be added that I didn't include, or questions about what I've identified so far?
Fred, I kind of getting into my pitch deck here, but I think that the rate of employee pay is something that really needs to be considered when you're talking about the level of service of especially the servers, the people that are making that contact day in and day out. And if you're in the mid to low range of pay, there's going to be a lot of turnover. Number one, as soon as they find another job that pays more, they'll be gone. But I think if you're paying people, in some relation to your profits, and people that work in these businesses, I mean, every business, I know what they're selling for. I mean, I can see how many units go out the door. I can figure that out. That's no big deal. And and if I'm paying below market rates, or something below the medium, the people will they'll just go. Then the attitudes, they won't want to learn, no matter how much training you get. So I guess that's if I were to start a business, E&L Brewery that we're talking about, I mean, I would always strive to keep my people at the top of the market of pay, and everything would flow out of that. They would be looking for training. They'll be doing anything they can, because if people are coming in, they're going to get bigger tips. They're going to have more money, and that's what people need. But they would be invested in the margin of the company then, and the thing would run itself.
Well, it's a fair point. I don't know that I concur with that. It would run itself. But I get where you're going. I think that haven't identified that on these slides because paying people well and motivating them in company culture is true in both environments, production and on-premise tasting room. So, but I think it's a great thing to reflect on when you're talking about training and adding the staff and how you're going to keep them around, how you're going to keep that expertise there. I think it's a great reflection. I think it's not isolated to hospitality, but it is certainly true in it. And hospitality changes the number of employees, and those employees typically have more jobs available in the marketplace. So it is different in hospitality and more heightened than in production. Because there's a bunch of other restaurants they can go get work at. That doesn't have to be a brewery, where a brewery production employee has a little smaller universe in terms of where they can go get work. Anybody else have questions or comments? All right. I'm looking forward to visiting your tasting room. Says it looks like they'll all be highly trained, well appointed standards of excellence for your brand identities. All right, so I'll jump into this next slide. I just looked at the chat. So yes, Frank, I have the pitch decks available here, and I can share my screen to make that easy. Unless you want to share yours, I can do that as well. Or I can change the settings so that you can share your screen, but I can also share it and click ahead when you want me to. I see we've got one volunteer and Paul so far for pitch decks. Anybody else had a dose of bravery?
I would give the technical side. I mean, I'd like to do the pitch deck, but the technical sharing of screens and stuff is something I've never done.
Okay, I got that. Hannah, you raise your hand. You're in.
Yeah, I'll do mine too, if there's time.
Yep, that was Trevor.
Gage.
Oh, Gage. Gage, Trevor, were you also nodding or no?
Yeah, if there's time, I can go too. But
Okay.
no
Yeah,
big
we'll
deal.
make time.
Yeah.
So I'll try to be done with this at 15 minutes. Then it might be 15 or 20 in pitch decks, and should be 7:40 or so, and I'll hand you off to the quiz, something like that. Does that sound good? All right. So you won't want to spend too much time on this last one anyways. It's math. All right. So I just felt it important to kind of talk about this because I think it's one of those things that's like could be a question. And I just took some average, some sort of really broad stroke pricing, not to illustrate that, hey, this is, I just want to be clear that this isn't me telling you these are the market average prices that you should shoot for. I grabbed some numbers that seemed to make some sense so that I could illustrate the flow. And so the point here is that, and I'm kind of making well, you'll see, I kind of have a technical suggestion that some people do and some people don't that might be helpful. But if you first look at retailer over here, this is meaning a Class C retailer that's not a producer. So they're selling $6 pints of beer and they're getting $7.44 in revenue, top line revenue, when they sell 124 pints. So, and this brings up another point. Hannah, you asked about how do people account for waste? And one way they do it is go to like 14.5 ounces. Well, they can do it other ways. I think one way you're doing is by counting 16 ounces. Some people will say there's an ounce of foam. I'm only going to count 15, or my pints are a little smaller. So they're estimating more pints per keg by lowering the ounces in a given pint. And I instead go by 16. So we're saying foam and waste maybe accommodate each other, but we're being conservative in terms of getting 124 pints instead of 136 or something like that. Anyways, for this point, it's all even. It's just saying top line revenue per keg is $744. Now they paid $145 for that keg from the wholesaler. So that means their gross margin at the retail side, after they take out the cost of the keg, is they made $599 per keg, which is a 19% beverage cost. That's pretty good. My pricing is probably off, and that they would probably sell that for $5 a pint and make 25% beverage cost, or that keg would cost less. But in any case, that's how they would estimate their costs based on their sale price. Now that same $6 pint in a tasting room, and this will sort of illustrate a suggestion if you can follow along, is that that same $6 pint brings in $744, the same size keg, same number of pints. But that pub, the tasting room, and here I didn't want to use PTR, tasting room, because that'd be confusing with price to retailer. Anyways, I'm saying it costs the pub $100. That's if you got rid of the wholesale margin, and you would be essentially at the same pricing as an FOB. So if you said production sold the keg to the tasting room, even if it was just sliding across the cooler, if you didn't go through a wholesaler, you're only taking that 30% out. But giving the tasting room an actual hard cost instead of a, well, I don't know, it costs whatever it costs to make it. I'd have to do the math. Restaurant models don't do well with, I have no idea how much that beer cost because he brewed it over there and then they just tapped it. And so you have to do a whole brewery study to figure out what that cost. I suggest creating an FOB, a non-freight price to wholesaler, that you would sell that, not necessarily technically sell, but you would journal entry over to your tasting room so the tasting room can gauge their pricing and understand whether they're profitable. They have an advantage over the retailer because they're getting their beer for 30% less. So they're getting the keg for $100, which means they have $643 in gross margin, which would actually be a 14% beverage cost. So the tasting room has an advantage over a typical restaurant, but is not addressing the cost of production. They're addressing the cost of being a retailer, right? So with this margin, they need to pay their servers, they need to buy glassware, they need to do all the things that a retailer does. And what this allows is production over here on the right to say, we're selling our keg at $100, whether it goes to a wholesaler or it goes to the pub, doesn't matter. We need to be profitable at $100 per keg. Does that make sense? There's still margin available here because typically, if you were making 30% gross margin, which is, a wild broad stroke, then you'd be making $30 per keg. Now, there's some questions here. Why does it cost more for the public, or why does it cost more in the tasting room setting? Well, for one, they're paying servers, they're buying glassware, tables, chairs, they're paying insurance, all that stuff. Normal sort of, why do I pay more for beverage in a pub than in a store for home? Another question is, why is it important to match retailer pricing? So this is an even bigger deal on shelf pricing, but if you are a distributed brand that also has a tasting room and you say, well, I'm getting my beer for less, if I were going to make the same percentage cost, I'd sell this pint at $3.50. Well, your retailer over here is going to not want to serve your beer very much longer if the customers are telling them, why are you charging it $6? I can get it $3.50 at the brewery. You're gouging me, right? They're going to say, I don't need the hassle. I'm done with this. So your pint pricing or your shelf pricing, your to-go pricing should be similar to the best pricing in the market from a traditional licensee. That way you're not undercutting them, and you're going to have to suffer with making more money on that product than the retailer. So that is a market condition that affects your retail pricing. And once you figure out your averages, you can still kind of create it, but it's important to double check that. If you're not distributing in the marketplace, you have a little more freedom there, but you still have, and you could be a little bit under, I think, but there'd be a point where you're leaving money on the table where people would be happy to pay that standard price. But you have some opportunities to promote or use the opportunity to have some pricing advantages. But I generally like to say our favorite craft brands in the universe are rarely because of price, they're because of something else. So promoting with price is not always your way to brand strength. So this idea, this method I talked about, what would be the value of charging the tasting room from production instead of just having the tasting room revenue be the same as production revenue? And the advantage is that this allows production to be able to evaluate their profitability on a fixed sale cost that's relative to their effort. And that department's effort stops at the cooler door, right? And so why can they make less money per keg? Because they can stack 16 of them on a pallet and drop it on a truck and do that with one person. So there's a volume that's implied at production side that, and a logistics that's simpler and less costly. The number of people that have to touch the beer for it to get to the consumer is higher. The amount of materials, the amount of time, the amount of overhead costs is considerably different in the tasting room. And so my argument here, which again, not everybody does this, and so it's really a preference point, but I wanted to illustrate this opportunity that if you give tasting room a cost of good to the keg that is per keg, and the same goes for bottle or whatever, or case of spirits. If you do that per unit, then, same day they can determine their revenue versus their cost, versus end of month having to get a report from production about raw materials and yields and, figuring out the actual cost of a product takes a lot of time and analysis. But a restaurant or a retailer doesn't have to, they have to do that with their food. Maybe they don't have to do it with their beverage. They're able to say, I got my invoice cost. I know what my pint cost me per brand because it's on an invoice. So then they can do a vertical analysis, a P&L analysis, and say, here's what our gross margin is in the tasting room because we have our fixed costs on beer. Same with production. I sold this many kegs to the tasting room. They moved this amount of money over to pay for those kegs. I know what my top line revenue is. I don't have to wait for the manager to close out on Friday night because I got the revenue when the kegs went into the cooler. So then production can do a vertical P&L analysis by saying, I know what my top line revenue is because I sold 10 kegs at $100. And then I do all my raw goods analysis to figure out my cost and to figure out whether my margin is intact. So it creates departmental pricing, costing, and P&L analysis to have that transitional transaction between the two, even if they're one company, one building, they are two departments. So that's a sort of primer on costing. And this also shifts, realize that we went from percentage of cost to percentage margin because production, that's just sort of a shift in the way you look at it. Once you're on premise, they want to look at beverage cost. All right. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions there? So, and on tonight's quiz, there are questions on hospitality and then on last week's sales and distribution. And then that's the last quiz before group project and final exam. So 7:16, that's pretty close. Who wants to go? Well, first, any other questions, or do we want to just get into taking a swing at pitch decks? And I would say, you know, anywhere between like 3 to 5 minutes should work. Doesn't have to be long, and shouldn't be too long. Who's up first? Paul, you want me to share your slides? I'll share all of them, just and then that way it's easier. So
I'm fine with it.
okay, I think I'm going to share them because then I don't have to change the Zoom stuff. So you're up.
I'm up. Are you gonna, do I go through the slides, or are you just gonna get going through them for me?
Yeah, you can just tell me when you want to go. Like,
Okay, we can start with that one.
yep.
All right, this is my brew pub. It's Fegan's Brew Pub. It's the 8 to 80 blind cripple of crazy style brew pub where everybody's welcome and mind your manners. So, next slide. It's at Fegan's we brew a good-natured beer that is agreeable and cordial to the palate. Our flagship brew is our Fegan's peanut brittle stout. It's a compilation between my favorite style of beer and my grandfather's favorite peanut brittle. That was my favorite childhood memory, making that stuff with Grandpa, along with a pleasantly delectable, made from scratch, home-cooked finger food suited to pair with any of our many and always expanding selections of fine brew. Our demographics and why we'll cater to all. With that being said, our main audience will be pandering for the millennials. With our outdoor games, sitting areas, and ever-changing lawn art, I believe we will accomplish this. The younger crowd and this demographic keeps changing, new to old. They're looking for a place to go and experience, not just sit, eat, drink, and go. I believe they will return with friends, family to expose them to a great experience. Understanding that this is a business venture, I firmly believe that what we are offering here, as far as food, drink, and memorable atmosphere, our clientele will not only expand, but be genuinely loyal. So where do we see ourselves and how do we fit? So our place in the big picture. Yes, we'll be competing with other brew pubs for beer, selections, and creativity of food. On that point, we will keep on top of and keep exploring different styles and incorporating different ingredients, not only for our beer, but food selection also. But for the overall experience of the atmosphere, the interactive characteristics of our place, we will make our own marketplace. As far as our pricing is concerned, and I know that that's an essential point of this presentation, our pricing will fall in line with our competitors, as we need not to drive anyone off. We do know what our bottom line is and the need to satisfy you as our investors and ourselves. Thank you.
All right.
How far did I tank?
Good job. Does anybody have feedback they want to share? I think I'll be going through and giving you some feedback in a written manner. I mean, I feel like I got the feel of what you're going for. I think from a pitch deck point of view, that you could think about creating some things to stand out from your messaging that's there was all very written paragraph style. I think you might want to find a way to pull out highlights and demonstrate them some way. Get your high points to stand out more so that somebody could skim if they wanted to and still get the idea. Here, I feel like you needed to read everything to understand it. You may want to equip that for both types of readers or settings.
Thank you. That's my, the biggest thing all my English teachers say. I write like I talk.
There's a lot of people that are trying to figure out how to write like they talk.
Thank you.
Yep. Who's next?
Sure, I'll go, Fred.
All right. And your file name is Madsen Deck. Did I get that right?
No,
that would be
mine is,
mine.
that would be
Oh.
Jim Madsen.
Oh, sorry. Edwin and Frank Microbrewery.
Correct.
Gotcha. All right. There you go.
Oh, okay, thank you. This is Edwin and Frank Microbrewery. We decided we were going to try to work backwards and then try to identify our customer. And one of the big things that we wanted to do is to try to focus in on women. And so we wanted to have more of a comfortable session atmosphere. This is what I call a inflection point to differentiate our products and services from other places. And, I think too many breweries, it's like they want to bring you their version of a beer. And we're going to work backwards from that. We're going to try to understand what our customers want in a beer and then brew it for them. Next slide, please. And so, what we did is we had a 5-year revenue plan, and and you can just look at the total of $2,800,000, over 5 years. And so this is working backwards from where do we want to be in 5 years, and then what do we have to do to get there? And so year 1, year 2, year 3, you can plainly see that we have realistic expectations of not making a whole lot of money in the first few years, and but then after 5 years, we'll be able to say that we've made some money and move on. Next slide, please. And so we went through some, calculations and, daily and some, daily revenue, and tried to extend that out over to the yearly. And then you can see that the yearly gross revenue, 270 barrels. So we wanted to get some kind of, a feel for how many barrels of beer do we need to brew. And then we need to start thinking about sizing our equipment from that. So again, we're working backwards, from what we expect to sell to, now we're looking at our equipment. Next slide, please. What we've done is one of the things that we focused in on was whenever you go out to any kind of trail or anything, is that 8 or 9 out of 10 people that are running are women. Running is a huge thing in women's sports now. And so we thought we would try to focus in on that. And, it's something that I have a personal connection to, as my daughter is a runner. And so I have some, knowledge and interest in the subject. It's another one of those things that when people finish a marathon, they drink a beer. So there's, it's a recovery type thing. What we want to do is to make sure that we have a large margin. Our employees know it. We want to keep the pay at a high level to cut down on turnover. That the people will know that they have an interest in the legacy of the company. So human retention is, one of the things that people talk about, and that's going to be one of the things that's going to be a core driver of our business. Next slide, please. So one of the slides that we saw was that only women make only 1 of 4 craft brew consumers. And, since Title IX, women's sports has exploded in popularity over my lifetime. Again, we talked about running, and that's one of the things that we're going to focus on. one of the critical things that I think that we really miss is in the concept of throughput. I mean, we're making gallons and gallons of beer, and that has to go someplace. And you know, and you know, I certainly don't want to offend anybody, but people have to pass this beer through their bodies in some manner. And one of the biggest things, if you ever go to a large sporting event, anything where there's a lot of beer consumption, is that women's bathroom facilities are the same size number of fixtures in there as men's. And physiologically, women are different, and we need to recognize that. I've talked to you know, several women, and you know, this is a big thing for them. And so we're going to you know, double or triple the size of our restroom facilities. I also think that CIP, cleaning in place, is also is a great opportunity to be able to keep the restrooms clean, because that's a huge complaint for women, is that the restrooms are just nasty. I mean, that's what I've heard. I mean, they're just nasty. So I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna argue with that or try to soft pedal it or anything. But I think that you know, just even having a hose bib in the bathroom, the employees that are responsible for cleaning it could sweep it out, hose it down. They don't have to touch anything, and you have a nice, sparkling, clean bathroom. So that's one of the inflection points that I think that would differentiate it. We wouldn't like advertise it. I think it would just be a word of mouth type of thing, and people would come. I think more women would come with men to, you know, to our place, because they know there's a decent restroom in there. And if women are coming, they would bring their men, and we would also have beer that would be geared more towards men, like the quadruple Russian Imperial Stout. Thanks. So, and then the site and location, you know, we're looking at Livonia, which is really kind of skinny on the walking, strolling downtown area. So what we'd have to do is to try to have a large building that people could, you know, clubs and things could bring in their cars. They could bring in their kayaks, you know, and things. And so industrial space is relatively cheap. You know, it's open access. We could have a lot of different types of activities in there. So the environment of the building itself would have to be something that people would come for a destination and then would stay there for a while. And I'd also have to always put a plug for Sibling Reverly in Westlake, Ohio. It's in an industrial park. It's a beautiful place. They make some wonderful beer down there. And I think, is that the last slide? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So thanks. That's kind of like a cold reading of those slides, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, good job. Anybody have feedback or reaction? Great. I have.
I got one feedback.
Yeah.
Frank, I like Fred's slide better. He had for $6, he had a pint pour instead of 12 ounces. I was just going to bring that to light.
Yes, my imaginary brewery had a pricing and had 4 more ounces for Paul. I had a couple points. I think some of that I'll leave more detailed feedback for sending you physically. I think you want to clarify your revenue, that you were clarify that it's top line revenue, that those numbers are, and then also make sure you don't. I'll have to go back and look, but make sure you don't count it twice. So I think you had pub revenue and then you had brewery revenue, and as long as you're not counting that twice, you'll be good. But it looked like it's possible that you're counting the revenue for the pub, and that includes the revenue that's going to go over to production to pay for the beer to the pub. So you might want to just evaluate that. And I think I also want to I'll remind you guys to tell me who your audience is, because I think this pitch deck, there was some language that I might warm up a little and soften a little bit if it were for public. And if it were for sort of architectural design or investors and talking about the bathrooms in a more technical way makes sense. Otherwise, I think that language could, you said it sort of better than what was in the slide in terms of women care about bathrooms and we need to make great ones because they're an important segment of our audience. It's sort of different than, talking about everybody's got to pee, if that makes sense. So, and I realize I'm into sort of content development because I can't help myself versus just the overall structure. And I also just want to say that the story of your daughter being a runner and bringing your awareness around is much more powerful and not on the slides. And I think if you're, and I know this is an imaginary brewery, but I think it's still a learning opportunity that I think customers want to see themselves in the brands that they visit. And so Edwin and Frank Brewing has a larger canyon to cover in terms of why would women runners see themselves in that brand than a story of being inspired by your daughter and inspired by women's running. That is a story where that the target audience you're talking about could connect to. So when you're building these things, I would consider that is not only who is my target audience, but how am I making an opportunity for them to connect? And is it genuine? And so as you're talking about it, made a lot more sense to me than if it were just the slides alone. Thank you. Who's next?
I'll go next.
All right. What was your file name?
I think it was just pitch deck.
Okay, gotcha. Is that the Whitmore? No.
No.
I'm the Whitmore.
Okay. Hold on. Pitch deck. What's your last name, Gage?
Fryz. Fryz.
Oh, yeah. New Michigan Distillery?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, I got you. File management.
All right. Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of background, one of my personal goals is to start a distillery. So sorry, Fred, I didn't make up all these logos and mock-ups just for your assignment, but I kind of had this stuff in the works prior and I kind of just rearranged things to fit this assignment really well.
Perfect.
So yeah, up at the top, it says my target audience for this pitch deck is our potential investors.
Okay.
I start off with the vision here. New Michigan Distillery is a leader in the next era of craft spirits engineering. Through the use of the most recent and cutting edge technologies, it crafts a higher quality product than the status quo and does not necessarily carry an equally as high price tag. From its beginning, it was structured in a way to create a more sustainable future, which has relied on the use of renewable and reusable energy, recycled materials, and negative carbon emissions. The distillery includes a tasting room connected to a restaurant, which makes the venue as a whole a popular weekend destination for many types of people. A trip to the Gastro Distillery is a unique experience that you cannot get elsewhere. The customers are people from nearby counties, as well as people interested in craft spirits and different dining experiences that are willing to travel to new venues. Many customers enjoy eating Friday night dinner at the restaurant and continuing the evening enjoying freshly made spirits in the tasting room. The restaurant portion and distillery atmosphere also make it a popular weekend brunch spot. The team members of the distillery who work day in and day out believe in the vision of the business and contribute to its success. Every member of the team is highly trained in their respective roles so that they can boast the confidence required to do their job effectively. So I go on a little more about the logo here. The logo for the brand, I wanted it to be really modern and simple, easy to digest and understand for a potential customer comparing spirits on the shelf. And then the new Michigan name and the evergreen background and deer silhouette kind of appeals to Michiganders, I guess. One product, when you start up a distillery, you'd have to have only unaged spirits sell first. So one of the first products would be New Michigan vodka. New Michigan vodka is carefully reflux distilled multiple times using the greatest process control and filtered after distillation to extract byproducts made from the fermentation to improve smoothness. So got some cool label mock-ups here. Next slide. And then I go on a little bit here about the location of New Michigan Distillery, where it would go. I think this is something that might be overlooked sometimes. It's important to take a lot of different things into account. And I go into 3 different things here. So obviously, number one, you want to kind of look up, okay, where are the other currently operating distilleries at in the Metro Detroit area? So you kind of plot that in Google Maps, that map up there on the top left corner. And as you can see, the more north and west you travel, you don't really have any distilleries out that way. So that's my first point is, maybe the area around where Novi's at, Wixom, South Lyon, Milford, maybe that could be a great area for a distillery. Point number 2, the map that's right next to it, you can see it's not that great of resolution, but what this is a population density heat map. So, okay, you look at where the other distilleries are at, but it doesn't do you any good if, you put a distillery in a town that's 200 people and that's it, So, also plotting and I guess overlaying a population density heat map with where the other distilleries are in the area would be a good business thing to do. Number 3, you also, of course, want the people who live in the area to have money. So you also overlay with gross income by zip code. Now, it's kind of hard to tell by this map at the bottom here, but where that black box is there is kind of where I think like South Lyon, that's Milford zip code. So the darker colors like purple, those people actually make more money. And, a distillery and spending lots of money on craft spirits and nice cocktails, that's going to run you some money. So I consider it a luxury. So taking into account population density, where the current distilleries are already operating, and overlaying that with gross income, I think an area like South Lyon, Milford, Novi possibly would be a great location for New Michigan Distillery. And that's all I got.
Great. Thank you. So I think that I think the work you did on location assessment is really good. That puts a lot of that gets the viewer thinking about and nodding along and saying, this makes sense. I can see how you're sort of zeroing in on it. So I like that a lot. I think that if you have a longer term plan of other brands, you verbally, you were saying we got to start with vodka, white spirits first because of the nature of it. But I think that if you're talking to investors, that would be an area that you could expand more and say, I see 3 stages of brand development. This is what we have the most developed because it's first. Then I see, if you see going into other things, where we sort of saw that snapshot of right now for spirits. And I
Mhm.
just think an investor might want a little longer view. But I think also if you're in this early stage and you're talking about scouting locations, it's excellent for that. So sort of depends on its purpose. But I felt that's an area that if I were, and I'm not even really talking about from a grading point of view, I'm just talking about from an assessment point of view that might be helpful. But I thought, good job on bringing in that demographic. It was useful. All right, we got Hannah and Trevor next. Who wants to go? Hannah. All right. Let me pull your file up. So I'm assuming your PowerPoint is the same as, oh, you have two, right?
Yeah, or no, I just have the 1-3 slide thing that I sent you.
Yeah, I had created a separate one for a different purpose for the Whitmore.
Okay, I got you.
Oh yeah, so before mine goes up, the idea was that this was a very very simple pitch deck just to talk to like city council, or depending on where you are and how close your location might be. If you're within a certain radius of like a church or something, they have to sign off on your location being there. So this is a very like, I had a very like soft pitch in mind, and mostly just convince anyone who would maybe have hesitation about having a brewery or distillery in their community, to feel a little bit better about why they should have us around. So that's the context for this.
Great. And I have the right, I have the correct file up.
Yep, that's me.
Okay.
All right, so the Whitmore, we'd like to be on Whitmore Lake, and we want to keep it small and simple. We aren't trying to compete with any of the big breweries or anything like that. We really just want to be a community business and community space. So we want to promote beer education, and not just different styles of beer, but what it means to, what it means to consume beer. Our big, really our mission is sustainability. And so that is going to be about accountability on our part as producers and the accountability of consumers. So that's partly where the beer education comes in. And then with community service, we want to have a mug club, and one of the conditions to join our mug club is that you have to give back to your community. So we are challenging our customers to be involved as much as possible. And then the way we're going to give back to our community, in addition to hosting community service cleanups or whatever to be a part of our mug club, we will also try to make sure that we have a low carbon footprint, striving for 100% recycling. It's probably not something that's going to happen right away, but we won't consider ourselves successful until we reach that goal. Using locally sourced ingredients in Michigan, and being responsible with our water. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the average brewery uses about 7 gallons of water for every gallon of beer that's produced. We would invest upfront in some fairly expensive technology to bring our water usage down to hopefully an average of 3 gallons of water for every gallon of beer produced. Another way we're going to give back, if you all are fans of the Rat Pack brewing competition that used to happen at Arbor Brewing Company, we would be encouraging home brewers and other folks who want to get into the industry and offer free education. So they can bring a home brew, they can compete, and then not only will we help them brew their beer, but we'll talk about the process, how to create beer sustainably, and encourage other folks to create beer responsibly, because unfortunately, beer is not sustainable. And it's something that we have to think about. And we take living next to all these great bodies of fresh water for granted. And we want to make sure that our brewery is something that people can enjoy now and feel good about enjoying 30 years from now. And that, you know, ultimately, we're at least creating a, sorry, I'm trying to think of the right word, net neutral instead of, if not a net good for our community. So that's why you all should, I don't know, encourage us to open up our space in this community. Sorry, I was not really prepared, but I thought I'd go for it. So
It's great. And I appreciate also framing that in terms of who you're presenting to is a great example of shaping your presentation, that is going to require focusing on things that they're ready to digest. So I like the example of, I just think it's an illustrative example to say, you know, we're just trying to get the community to think this is a good idea prior to even going into the next steps. I think
Yeah.
the one thing that stood out for me that would be helpful would be on your water use bullet point, you expressed 3 gallons, but if you weren't there to couch that in terms of what it meant to the industry, if somebody were reading this later, if they forwarded it on, you know, regardless of whether you have the opportunity to present, I would think that I would just want to compare that to the national average and say, compared to 7 barrels, you know, we're preparing just what you said. Through investment in technology, we're preparing to use 50% less water, 3 barrels compared to 7 nationally. That is going to travel better if somebody forwards that file or wasn't listening for a minute. It's there to demonstrate that 3 barrels is significant. But without that context, 3 barrels is just words on a page to a non-brewer.
right. Thank you. That makes sense.
All right. Great work. We got one left. And if anybody's anxious to get to the quiz, feel free to duck out and get to it when you want. But we got one less unless we got any other volunteers. Trevor, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. Let me make sure your file's open. Oops, I'm on the last page. All right, you're up.
Cool. All right, we got the Powerhouse Brewery. We aim to be a brewery and distillery that uses a mix of technology and tradition. You can see here, right front and center, I have an old power substation that actually sits on the property. So instead of ignoring it and pretending it's not there, kind of want to embrace the architecture in the area and bring that into the name and some of the elements of the brewery. So, next slide. We'll be located right downtown Linden. This just kind of goes with our historic practices with a modern twist. There's an old mill. It's been dormant since the 50s, but they still got a decorative water wheel there. And our plan is to use solar panels on the roof for not only grain milling, but lots of other pumping operations, glycol chillers, brewery pumps, and lighting and things like that all around the brewery. So we'll kind of have an homage to the milling operations of back in the day. Next slide.
Trevor, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Can you tell us who you're presenting to?
Oh yeah, I was kind of in between the city council and potential investors. I think this kind of speaks to both of them a little bit, and I think they'll get something out of it.
Sounds good.
Our aim is to also use traditional recipes along with our modern equipment. I have here George Washington's presidential pre-prohibition porter, which is one of the first beers that was promoted here in the US to get away from using foreign trade. So we're supposed to use local ingredients to make it. And we'll kind of always have these in 2 different styles at the same time. So we'll have our pre-prohibition porter that's using adjuncts that are found here in the US, and then newer American porter, which doesn't tend to use any adjuncts. It's going to have new recipe to it, something that's always kind of current with what's going on in the beer scene. And the other stuff here, California Common, you'll kind of see the link there with new brown ales and the old St. Louis lagers to what most people would know as American Light Lager. And our new brewing methods are obviously new malting methods and using steam heat and things like that. Next slide. We have a classic look here, new designs. We got the old building. It's got a pretty nice roof line. Kind of looks like an old barn. It's an old warehouse. I really like the feel of that, the kind of rustic look, old. We're going to bring in some modern amenities to it. Hopefully we can bring in some roll-up doors, these nice window doors so we can see the outside. We always want to be connected to the outdoors because we're sitting right here on the mill pond, sit right in the middle of the downtown. We want to be able to take in the scenery of the area at all times of the year. And when the weather's right, we can obviously roll them up and get right out there into the sun. And we're going to connect with downtown by having a boardwalk, a dock, hopefully canoe docking stations. We'll get in there with some paddle boats, some kayaks, some pedal boats, and really bring in the focus on the outdoors and connecting with the downtown area. Next slide. And here's kind of where the opportunity comes in. This is go with the hotel roots. I'm a third generation resident of the city. And nice location sitting right here on the river. The city has plans to revitalize, and instead of getting in after they've gone through the revitalization period, I would actually like to be a pillar of that and get in there and help build up the community by bringing people downtown and keeping them downtown and bringing in tax revenue so they can keep moving forward with new projects. And as you can see, a lot of residents are looking for a microbrewery in downtown. They want a place to sit and eat lunch and drink beers and have memorable beers to drink and take in the atmosphere of the downtown area. They want to spend more time down there, and they don't really have the opportunity right now. And there is a large retail gap that's been noticed in this area, not only in drinking places directly, but also with food. So I think it'll be an excellent place to go and bring this stuff to the community.
Awesome. Great job. There's a lot there. I like the way you tied the community in and gave several different examples of how you'd be integrating. I mean, I feel like if I were a community member, I'm already visualizing, I'm thinking about how it fit in and what it'd be like to have it there. So that means you've done a good job of putting enough elements that it doesn't just feel like your vision, it feels like a vision. One little technical thing, but I feel like I would go back in cosmetically and look at how you had those beer styles listed because of the bullet point and the dash. And then the first two being porter, like it looked like the George Washington porter was the American porter and the California Common was a brown ale, versus those looking like 6 different beers. Little formatting issue, but that I was chewing on that for a second until you accompanied it verbally. But that's a really small thing. I think that was a great example of a community, city council sort of warm up. I will say that on all of them, one thing I started thinking about it, and I'll make some more detailed notes on all of them. I think there's a place to indicate your license type and what are those adjacent things that you're going to include. You guys, it's a natural thing. You focused on what you're most curious about yourselves and what you're most intent on yourselves and the key points of where your vision is. And that's what you ought to be doing. But on the other hand, if I'm city council, are you going to have food? Are you going to have a liquor license? I don't necessarily know the difference between license types, whether you illustrate that to me or not. An investor may want to know, but still, I'm assuming that since you all had tasting room models, if you're a brew pub, you're going to need to have food. And those are the things that weren't included here. And I don't think you need to be going into menu development, but that's an area that I don't think got addressed by anybody. And if I'm city council, I'm trying to, you mentioned lunch. So there's an assumption there's food. Anyways, that was an overall thing that I started thinking about, was consistent between all the decks. And even though we're breweries and distilleries, once we show up in a city council meeting, we're now representing the whole business, and you gotta treat them like a blank slate that needs everything to be portrayed. Now, we're still choosing which part of that is relevant to this deck, which part can be digested, which part is compelling. But we just want to think about, have I painted the whole picture? So great work. And unless anybody's got anything else, I'll leave you to the quiz. And then next week I'll have grades for these and grades for the forecast done, which will include whatever commentary that may help you with your business plans. And then next week we'll be primarily being able to talk about where you are, what you have questions with. So there's not a prepared outline. So the more you guys think ahead about what you need help with, the more we'll get out of that class. Make sense? All right. If nothing else, again, I'll leave this open. Well, maybe not. Just shoot me an email if anything goes haywire with the quiz. I was like, I'll make sure I check in just to make sure it's functioning properly. I always have a little Blackboard anxiety that everything's going to work. So with that, I'll leave you to it. Thanks. Good job, everybody.
Good night, everybody.